The call came at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning in October, and Cobb Greer had already been at the kitchen table for more than an hour, with a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He was not a man who slept past 5 on working days, had not been for 40 years. But this particular morning, he had not gone to the barn, or walked the fence line, or done any of the things that normally filled the hour before full light. He had simply sat. Outside the window, the Tennessee Hill Country was doing what it does in October, pulling color out of the hardwoods along the ridgeline, laying a low gray mist across the valley floor, making the whole landscape look like something that had decided to become permanent a long time ago and had not reconsidered since. He watched it without watching it, the way a man looks at something so familiar it has become part of how he thinks rather than what he sees. Vera was at the counter when the phone rang. She had come downstairs 20 minutes after him, which was her habit, moving in the quiet, efficient way she moved through early mornings, and she had not asked him why he was sitting instead of working. She was Cobb's wife of 35 years, a woman who had married into the Greer patience the way you marry into a language slowly enough that you stop noticing the moment you became fluent. She understood the difference between a man who was troubled and a man who was waiting, and she had learned that the second kind needed the same thing the orchard needed in March, which was space to move at its own pace without being hurried into something it was not yet ready to do. When the phone rang, she set down what she was holding. She did not turn around. Cobb picked up on the second ring. The man's name was Preston Hale, a land use attorney out of Nashville whose voice carried the particular precision of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information clearly enough that no one could later claim they had not understood it. He had been retained 18 months earlier by the development consortium behind what was now publicly described as the Ridgecrest Resort and Commercial Campus, a $340 million project covering the northern end of Harlan County. He said the word frozen before he said anything else. Not delayed, not complicated. Frozen. He said it the way a doctor says a word that ends a conversation about waiting and begins a different conversation about what comes next. The project had stopped, not because of a court order, not because of a regulatory dispute, not because of financing. It had stopped because 4.3 acres of apple orchards sitting at dead center in the only viable road corridor between the development site and the state highway had made every engineering solution the consortium had attempted over the previous 2 years either physically impossible or legally indefensible. Preston used the phrase road corridor once, then waited. The silence on his end was the silence of a man who has said what needs to be said and is now listening to hear what kind of silence comes back. Cobb let it run for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the 47 apple trees were becoming visible as the light built their bare October branches, holding their shapes against the pale sky. The way things hold their shapes when they have been growing in the same place long enough that removal would leave a visible absence. He had looked at those trees on more mornings than he could count. He looked at them now with the same attention he had always given them, which was the attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at was not simply trees. Preston said the consortium needed to discuss acquisition options and that they were prepared to move quickly and compensate generously. He said significant twice within 30 seconds, which told Cobb something about what the man had been instructed to communicate before he got to any actual number. Cobb told him to come by Thursday and have lunch. He set the phone down, looked at his cold coffee, then looked across the kitchen at Vera, who had turned around now and was watching him with an expression that was not surprise, not relief, not the particular brightness that comes from news a person has been hoping for. It was the expression of a woman who has been carrying something alongside someone for a very long time and has just felt the ground shift under the weight of it. "They finally called," Cobb said. Vera turned back to the counter. "I know." He was 63 years old that October, born in Harlan County, raised on the same 4.3 acres. He still worked a man whose life had the shape of someone who had decided early what mattered and had not spent much energy second-guessing the decision. He ran the orchard the way his grandfather had run it, without ambition toward scale, without interest in becoming something larger than the land could sustain. He pressed cider in fall. He kept a table at the county market on Saturdays. He pruned in late winter, irrigated through August, turned the soil in the rows every other year with a tractor that was older than his daughter Marlo and ran better than it had any right to. He did all of it with the understanding that the work was not a means to something else. The work was the point. The land was the point. They had been the point since before he was born, and they would remain the point after he was gone, provided he did what needed doing in the years he had been given to do it. He had known this phone call was coming for 23 years. Not in the way a man knows something he has been told, but in the way a man knows something he has constructed from evidence one verified piece at a time, until the structure of it became more solid than most things people call certainty. 6 different engineering firms had looked at the topography of the north end of Harlan County over the previous decade and come back with variations on the same conclusion. The ridge running along the western boundary of Meridian's land was too steep for a graded commercial road. The creek corridor to the east crossed 2 private parcels whose owners had declined every approach. The county fairgrounds to the south were publicly held land whose sale the county commission had voted down twice in 4 years. The only flat, unobstructed, legally clear path from the state highway to Meridian's 7,500 acres was a 12-foot strip that had been in the Greer family since 1948. He had not always known this. He had not always known the strip existed or what its existence meant, or why his grandfather had spent 5 years after 1956 with a particular quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness in ways Cobb could feel but could not have described at 10 years old. The learning had taken time. It had taken a shoebox, a library, 14 months of Wednesdays, and a level of patience that most people would not have recognized as strategy because it looked so much like simply living. It had started at a county auction in the spring of 1961. The Harlan County Fairgrounds hosted the auction in the main exhibition building. 4 folding tables pushed together at the front, a coffee urn on a card table near the entrance that had been running since early morning, and showed it in the color and consistency of what it was producing. Maybe 30 people were scattered across rows of metal folding chairs, the majority of them present as observers, the way people attend public proceedings where the outcome is already determined and the watching is a form of record-keeping rather than participation. Harlan Greer had driven Cobb there in the truck without explaining the purpose of the trip beyond saying Cobb should come along and should wear his coat. The code instruction had seemed strange for a spring morning warm enough that most of the men in the folding chairs were in shirt sleeves. Cobb had asked about it, and Harlan had said nothing, which in Harlan's communication system was not rudeness, but information of a different kind. Cobb wore the coat. He had a spiral notebook on his knees when they sat down in the second row, a box of crayons on the chair beside him. He had spent the previous evening at the kitchen table drawing what he knew about their land. The red crayon for the outer boundary which he had walked with Harlan twice, and knew by the way the property lines intersected the fence posts and the creek bed to the south. The green crayon for the apple rows, 47 marks and 4 lines, each one a tree he could have found in the dark from the sound of wind moving through its particular branch structure. The brown crayon for the fence line along the northern edge, built in 1948 from posts cut on the property, running straight from the eastern stake to the western one, along what had then been open farmland. He had erased twice where the lines went crooked. When he finished, he looked at the map for a long time. The family land was a small square surrounded by everything else. That bothered him in a way that had no name yet. Donahue Voss arrived after the county clerk had finished arranging the paperwork, a timing that suggested either poor planning or the confidence of a man who understood the proceedings would not begin without him. He was somewhere in his late 40s with a build that had once been athletic and had since become something more deliberate, the kind of frame that suggests a man accustomed to arriving at things before other people thought to look for them. Blue tie, leather briefcase, shoes that had not touched unpaved ground since leaving his car. He was the regional land acquisition agent for Meridian Agricultural Holdings, a name that appeared on none of the surrounding deed transfers he was about to finalize and had been designed not to. He set his briefcase on the front table, looked out at the room with the ease of a man conducting an inspection of something he already owned, and his gaze moved across the rows until it reached Cobb's notebook. He looked at it. His eyes moved to Harlan, then back to the notebook. Something moved across his face that resolved into a kind of private amusement, the expression of a man who has found something confirming rather than surprising. "Is that a map?" Voss's voice carried to the whole room without effort. Harlan kept his hands flat on his knees. He did not look up. Voss leaned forward slightly, tilting his head to look at the crayon lines. He examined the red boundary, the small green square, the brown line along the north. Then he laughed. Not a polite social adjustment, not a brief acknowledgement. The full kind, the kind that fills a room because it is designed to fill a room, because a laugh that size in a space that size tells everyone present who sets the tone. Real Estate by Crayon Voss said, looking around at the folding chairs. That's something I haven't seen before. 3 or 4 people laughed along the reflex laugh of people in a room when someone with a briefcase establishes a register. Cobb felt the sound settle somewhere in his chest and stay there, not as pain, but as information. The kind of information that a 10-year-old body receives before the 10-year-old mind knows what to do with it. He did not look up from his notebook, neither did Harlan. Then Harlan leaned down to Cobb's ear and spoke in a voice low enough that the words belonged only to the two of them. Cobb picked up his pencil. He wrote the words on the blank page at the back of the notebook, working fast to get them exactly right. Then he tore the page out along the spiral edge, folded it twice, and put it into the front pocket of his coat. He understood now why Harlan had told him to wear it. The pocket was the reason. The auction moved through its business. Voss handled the room the way a man handles a transaction he has already completed elsewhere, and is now formalizing signing without reading. Closely shaking 3 hands, moving with the ease of someone for whom the difficult work happened in private months ago. Meridian Agricultural Holdings finalized the purchase of the surrounding 7,500 acres. The deed transfers covered every parcel adjacent to the Greer land in every direction without exception. The price per acre was low because the sellers had been approached separately at intervals through different agents with different names, and none of them had understood what they were collectively part of until the paperwork was in front of them. When Voss finished, he picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door. He passed the second row without stopping. "Good luck with your trees, old man," he said, still moving, not looking back. Harlan watched him go without expression. After the room emptied, a county clerk gave Harlan a copy of the surrounding deed transfers, standard procedure when an adjacent property owner was present at a public auction affecting neighboring land. Harlan took the papers and folded them into his coat pocket next to his own deed. He did it without looking at them the way a man stores tools he intends to use later and knows exactly where he has put them. Cobb was still in his seat with the crayon map on his knees. Harlan put one hand on the boy's shoulder and they walked out to the truck. Neither spoke on the drive home. The radio stayed off. The county road ran between fields going pale with late afternoon light, and Cobb watched the landscape without registering it, aware mostly of the folded page pressing against his ribs through the coat fabric. Vera had supper on the table when they got back. She set 3 plates and did not ask about the auction. She had learned when to ask and when to let things arrive on their own schedule, which was one of the qualities that had made her the right person to build a life with a man who processed things slowly and in private before he was ready to share them. They ate without much conversation. After supper, Harlan spread 3 papers across the kitchen table. He studied them for a long time. Then he looked at Cobb. "Keep your map," Harlan said. Cobb nodded. Harlan reached out and tapped one of the 3 papers with his index finger. Once not hard the way you indicate something to a person without explaining what they are supposed to see in it, because the explanation would take years, and the person is not yet old enough for years. Then he folded all 3 papers back into his coat pocket and went to bed. Cobb sat alone at this table with the crayon map in front of him. He looked at the small green square in the middle of the surrounding parcels. He looked at the brown line along the northern boundary running straight from stake to stake. He did not know what his grandfather had tapped, but he understood something the way a 10-year-old understands certain things before the understanding becomes language, a body-level certainty that sat in his chest like a stone that had not yet found its full weight. The man with the briefcase had made a mistake today. He could not have said what kind. He could not have named it or measured it or explained it to anyone who asked. He felt it the way you feel something that has already happened and is now simply waiting to be discovered. He sat with it until the kitchen light made his eyes heavy, then went to bed with the folded page still in his coat pocket and the map rolled into the front pocket of his school bag. 8 years passed, the way years pass on working land, each one shaped by what the season required rather than by what the people on it preferred. He was 17 when his father died of a heart that gave out without warning on a Tuesday morning in February, and 18 when he took over the full management of the orchard because there was no one else to take it, and the trees did not stop requiring attention because the family had suffered a loss. He learned the varieties the way Harlan taught him, not from books, but from observation across multiple seasons, understanding what each rootstock needed in wet years versus dry, how the Granny Smiths along the south fence handled late frost differently from the Fujis in the center rows. He learned the soil heavier in the northwest corner near the old drainage ditch, where clay ran deep, lighter along the southern fence where the grade dropped. He learned the gravity-fed irrigation system his grandfather had built in the early 50s, eccentric in its routing, inefficient by modern standards, completely reliable in the specific way that over-engineered old systems are reliable. He learned all of it because Harlan showed him, and because the land required it, and because somewhere underneath all of it was the crayon map in the wooden box and the folded page in his coat pocket, and the knowledge that he was tending something whose full meaning he had not yet been old enough to receive. The crayon map stayed in the wooden box on the shelf above the refrigerator with the deed papers. Cobb did not look at it often, but he kept it in the same place it had always been, and he knew exactly where it was. Harlan Greer died in the spring of 1969 at 79 years old, in the bedroom where he had slept for 5 decades on a Tuesday morning in April, when the apple trees outside his window were showing the first white of their blossoms. The county coroner said it was his heart which Cobb understood as accurate without being sufficient. Harlan had been the kind of man whose interior life ran so deep and so private that the people around him spent years aware of its existence without being able to see more than its surface expressions, and when it stopped, the absence had a specific shape that did not fill in the way ordinary absences do. He left Cobb the 4.3 acres, the 47 apple trees, and a wooden shoebox tied with a length of kitchen twine. The family gathered the day after the funeral, sitting around the kitchen table while the neighbors' food covered the counter. Cobb's uncle lifted the lid of the shoebox, looked at what was inside, set it back down. Land records, he said. Tax receipts, survey copies. Nothing that represented money or anything requiring division. They left the box on the shelf above the refrigerator, which was where it had always been. That evening, after the house was quiet, Cobb sat down at the kitchen table and untied the twine. The papers inside were not randomly organized. They had the order of a man who had arranged them for a particular reader, finding them at a particular moment, which meant they had been arranged for Cobb, which meant Harlan had known this moment would come and had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything ahead of time without announcing the preparation. The deed was on top. Below it, a stack of property tax receipts going back to 1940, everyone in Harlan's name or his father's before that. Below the receipts, 2 survey plats, 1948 and 1962. Below the plats, 3 letters from a Nashville law firm that Cobb set aside. At the bottom of the box, inside a plain white envelope with nothing written on the outside, was a single page. He opened it carefully. The document was a state notice dated March 3, 1956, headed with the state seal and the words, "Notice of Road Project Cancellation." It described the termination of State Route Spur 14B, a planned access road that had been surveyed, partially funded, and then canceled when state budget priorities shifted the previous year. The cancellation language was standard administrative prose. What was not standard was the 11 lines at the bottom of the page, the reversion clause, which described what happened to the land corridor set aside for the road now that the road was not going to be built. Cobb read those 11 lines 3 times. The corridor reverted to the adjacent landowner of record as of the date of cancellation. That was what it said in the flat bureaucratic plainness of state legal language. Not to the state, not into some public right-of-way category that would persist indefinitely. To the adjacent landowner of record as of the date when the cancellation became final, which was November of 1956. He got up from the table, went to the shelf, and took down the wooden box with the deed papers. He took out the crayon map. He unrolled it on the table next to the state notice. The brown line along the northern boundary. The fence his grandfather's grandfather had built in 1948 running straight across the top of the property from eastern stake to western stake. On the north side of that line, beyond the fence, was the strip of land that had been set aside for State Route Spur 14B, 12 feet wide, running from the county highway at the western end to the northern boundary of what was now Meridian's 7,500 acres at the eastern end. The adjacent landowner of record in November of 1956 was Harlan Greer. Cobb sat with this for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around him, in the way it gets after a death, not the ordinary quiet of a house in the late evening, but something with more weight to it, the quiet of a space that is still adjusting to a permanent absence. He looked at the crayon map. He looked at the brown line he had drawn at 10 years old, the northern fence. The boundary he had put in brown because brown was the right color for something built by hand from timber cut on the land. He had drawn that line from the deed papers without understanding that on the other side of it, since November of 1956, sat the only road access that Donahue Voss's 7,500 acres would ever have. Harlan had known since 1956. He had been sitting in the second row of the fairgrounds auction in 1961, with this knowledge folded into his coat pocket, watching Voss buy 7,500 acres of land with exactly one exit, and he had said nothing. He had let Voss laugh at the crayon map. He had let the room laugh with him. He had leaned down to his 10-year-old grandson's ear and said 7 words at a volume only the boy could hear, and then he had gone home and tapped one finger on a document at the kitchen table and gone to bed. Because Harlan Greer understood that some things cannot be explained to a 10-year-old. They have to be earned by a 30-year-old who has spent the intervening years learning what the land requires and what the law says and what patience actually means when it is not a virtue someone describes, but a practice someone maintains through 4 decades of Aprils. In the morning, Cobb told Vera he was going to the library. What followed was 14 months of Wednesdays at the Harlan County Public Library, a 2-room building on the west side of the courthouse square, where the afternoon light came through the south windows at an angle useful for reading small print on old documents. The librarian was Eunice Dray, a woman who had run that library since before Cobb was born, with the organized precision of someone who understood that the value of information depends entirely on whether people can find it when they need it. She had spent her professional life in a building full of things most people never thought to look for. She did not find Cobb's requests unusual. She pulled the volumes and left them at the second table from the window, which became his table by unspoken agreement sometime in the 3rd month. He cross-checked the state survey plat from 1956 against Harlan's original deed from 1948 to confirm the corridor's exact position relative to the Greer property line. He pulled the title chain for each of the surrounding parcels Meridian had purchased in 1961 and traced each one backward through every recorded transfer. He found what he had expected. The title company that handled the 1961 transaction had run a standard search. They pulled deed transfers. They pulled tax records for the parcels being sold. They had not pulled road project cancellation files because those were maintained in a separate index, in a separate cabinet, in a room on the other side of the building that most people did not know existed. Eunice Dray knew it existed. She had shown it to perhaps a dozen people in 20 years. The corridor was 12 feet wide and half a mile long. On paper, it looked like a strip of unmowed grass along a fence line, not notable, not valuable in any way that would show up in a standard assessment. But Cobb had stood at the eastern end of that strip in 1975 and looked south across 7,500 acres of flat-cleared farmland and understood what the maps confirmed. The ridge to the west was too steep. The creek to the east required federal wetland permits with a 40% approval rate and a 2-year timeline on the optimistic side. The fairgrounds to the south were not for sale at any price the county would approve. There was one way in and one way out of Meridian's land, and it ran through 12 feet of Greer property. He drove home on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1975 and sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment before going inside. Vera heard him arrive and had the kettle on when he came through the back door. He spread the papers across the kitchen table. The state notice, the survey plat, Harlan's deed. His own updated version of the crayon map drawn now in red pen with every parcel number, every boundary line, every owner of record annotated in the margins in his careful handwriting. Vera looked at the table for a moment. She looked at him. "What is it?" she said. He looked up from the papers. "A road that doesn't exist," he said. She studied the map. "You going to do something about it?" "Not yet," he said. She poured 2 cups and sat across from him without pushing. She had watched Harlan move through the world with a quality of deliberateness that other people sometimes confused with slowness, and she had come to understand over 20 years in this family that the confusion was the observer's problem rather than Harlan's. Patience in the Greer men was not the absence of a plan. It was a plan with a longer timeline than most people could hold in their heads without losing the thread. She had married into that quality the way you marry into a climate gradually, and then completely until you could no longer imagine operating in any other way. Cobb filed a quiet title action at the county clerk's office the following Monday morning. 2 pages, $32 in filing fees. The clerk stamped it without looking up. The action placed his claim to the corridor on the public record so that no future buyer of the surrounding land could argue they had not been notified. It was a small procedural move, legally precise, designed to mean nothing until the day it meant everything. He bought a green spiral notebook at the hardware store the same week. On the inside cover, he wrote the date, the corridor's parcel number, and the filing date of the quiet title action. On the first line of the first page, he wrote 4 words: "There is no other way." The following Saturday morning, he drove to the north end of the property and walked the 12-foot strip from the county highway to the eastern boundary of Meridian's land. He walked it twice, the second time more slowly. He stood at the eastern end and looked south across the flat expanse of Meridian's cleared farmland, running to the tree line where the ridge began. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the creek bed to the east marked by a dark thread of willows. He looked north along the county highway to where it curved toward the fairgrounds. He confirmed what the documents told him. There was no other way. He walked back to the truck and drove home along the county road that ran past the northern edge of the orchard. He slowed without stopping when he came even with the tree line. The 47 trees were past their blossoming and moving into the quiet work of setting fruit, standing in their rows in the late spring light with the particular permanence of things that have been correctly tended across many years by people who understood what they were tending and why. He thought about Harlan at the auction, the hands flat on the knees, the laugh that filled the room and the room that filled with it. He thought about the tapped finger on the paper at the kitchen table, the single contained gesture that said everything Harlan knew and nothing that Harlan was ready to say, and he understood it now in a way that was entirely different from how he had understood it at 10. At 10, it had been a signal whose meaning he could feel without being able to read. At 36, after 14 months in the library and a lifetime of watching a man who never moved without understanding exactly where he was going, he understood it as a transfer. Harlan had handed him something that could not be handed directly, only earned in the time between the giving and the receiving. He put the truck in the driveway and went inside to find Vera had started supper. He filed the notebook in the desk drawer in the study on top of the manila folder that held the state notice and the survey plats and Harlan's deed. The drawer closed with a weight that was satisfying in the specific way of a drawer that contains exactly what it is supposed to contain. The 47 trees stood in their rows outside the kitchen window in the long late light of a Tennessee spring evening, arranged by decades of careful placement into something that looked like permanence, because it was permanence the kind built one season at a time by people who were not in a hurry to be done because they understood that being done was not the point. Cobb poured a glass of water and stood at the window for a moment before calling to Vera that he was washing up for supper. Somewhere to the north of them, on the other side of the 12-foot strip, 7,500 acres of flat-cleared farmland sat in the same evening light with exactly one exit. The sun was going down over a ridge that was too steep for any road a man could build at a price any development could sustain. The corridor grass was growing. The 4 iron pins were where they had been driven in 1948. The county tax office would send a bill in April, and it would be paid in April, and a receipt would be filed in the desk drawer. And the year would move forward the way years move when a man knows where he is and what he is doing and is not in any particular hurry, because the thing he is waiting for cannot arrive until it is ready, and it will not be ready until every other option has been exhausted. The trap was set. All that remained was to wait for them to need it. The first of every month, Cobb Greer paid the property tax on the corridor strip before he paid anything else. The annual bill was $9 in 1979. It climbed to 14 by the late 80s, reached 22 by the mid-90s, and was 31 by the time the spring of 2001 brought the Chattanooga Construction Company's grading permits into the public record. A man could lose that much in a coat pocket and not notice for a week. But Cobb had understood from watching Harlan that a payment's significance is not in its size. It is in the unbroken chain of receipts that accumulates over decades until it becomes something that no legal argument can move. He kept every corridor receipt in a separate envelope from the orchard accounts, each one dated in his own hand across the top, filed chronologically in the bottom drawer of the study desk. By 1979, the envelope was thin enough to slide under a door. By 1995, it had become a stack requiring a rubber band. By 2002, the rubber band had dried and been replaced twice. The second thing he did every April was walk the corridor with a push mower his father-in-law had left in the barn when he moved to assisted living in Knoxville. The machine required a starting sequence involving 3 pulls, a pause, 2 more pulls, and a word Vera said did not appear in any language she had studied. When the engine seized in the spring of 1990, Cobb drove to the hardware store without urgency, selected a replacement by weight rather than brand-paid cash, loaded it himself, drove home. The following morning, he started on the corridor at 7 and finished before noon. He wiped the mower down before putting it away. 4 iron pins marked the corridor's corners, driven by a county surveyor in 1948, and confirmed accurate by a second survey Cobb commissioned in 1962, paid for out of the orchard's thin margin that year. Each pin was 3/4 of an inch in diameter, sunk 18 inches into Tennessee clay. He checked each one twice a year, April mowing and October mowing, pressing his thumb against the iron to confirm it had not shifted through soil movement, or frost heave, or the kind of deliberate relocation that a survey crew working for someone with a motive might accomplish on a quiet afternoon. The notebook recorded every visit. April 14th, 1981, all 4 pins clear, meridian grade crew, visible on the south end, orange survey flags. October 3rd, 1984, fall mow complete, no activity tax receipt filed. April 9th, 1987, east pin showing slight movement, reset by hand position, photographed. The entries were short. Cobb was not a man who wrote beyond what the record required. But every line was dated, every observable fact included every license plate number logged when Meridian survey trucks worked within reading distance of the road. Vera watched all of it from the kind of proximity that is not distance at all. She had read the documents once in the first week after Cobb spread them on the kitchen table in March of 1975, reading carefully, in an order, and without interruption. She did not need to read them again. What she developed over the years that followed was an understanding built from watching, rather than from documents, from the specific way Cobb held his shoulders differently on mornings after he had walked the corridor and written in the notebook and filed the tax receipt, a tightness that did not fully release until the notebook was closed and back in the desk. She saw how he read the County Gazette's business section with a quality of attention that was different from the attention he gave the rest of the paper, slower, more deliberate, the way a man reads something he expects to find a particular thing in and is tracking for the moment it appears. She understood that what her husband was doing over those years was not a project with a start date and an anticipated end. It was maintenance, the same discipline he brought to the irrigation lines in August and the grafting in March applied to a legal situation that operated on the same principle as any living system, consistent attention over a long timeline, no shortcuts, no years off. She had married into this quality. She had recognized it in Harlan before she fully understood it in Cobb, and she had understood in retrospect that it was among the things she had been looking for without knowing the name of it. In the late spring of 1979, on a Tuesday morning, a car Cobb did not recognize pulled into the driveway while he was in the barn with a pruning saw. The man on the porch was mid-30s, clean shoes, a manila folder under one arm. He introduced himself as Talmadge Pruitt, representing a regional land investment group, and he used that phrase twice in the first half minute, in the way people use phrases that have been chosen by someone else and have been repeated enough times to feel natural. He said he wanted to be up front. His clients were prepared to offer $8,000 for the corridor strip cash transaction, fast, close, no complications. $8,000 was more than most working men in Harlan County brought home in a year. Cobb looked at the folder under Pruitt's arm. He looked at the shoes. He thanked Pruitt for making the drive, shook his hand, said he appreciated the offer, and closed the front door. He stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of Pruitt on the steps, then the gravel, then the car door, then the engine. Then he went back to the barn and finished with the saw. Pruitt's report to his clients, which Cobb would not see for another 23 years when it appeared in a discovery filing, described the interaction. This way owner seems simple, does not appear to understand the strategic value of the parcel, may respond to a higher number in 6 to 12 months. Pruitt was partially correct. Cobb understood the strategic value of the parcel with a precision that would have substantially changed the tone of that report. He understood it differently than Pruitt did, which was the part Pruitt had missed. 7 years passed. The orchard produced. The notebook accumulated. The tax receipts built their stack. In the summer of 1983, Cobb's daughter Marlo was 12 years old, and she climbed into the passenger side of the truck during the October mowing preparation without being invited or discouraged, settling herself against the door with the ease of someone who had decided the question of whether she was coming and did not consider it open for discussion. She was a quiet child in the specific Greer way, which meant observant before verbal and thorough before expressive, inclined to watch a thing from multiple angles before she committed to having an opinion about it. She had her mother's precision with people, the ability to read a room's temperature before anyone else in the room had noticed it was changing. She watched him mow the corridor strip without comment. She watched him park at the eastern end and walk to the first iron pin and press his thumb against it. She watched him take out the notebook and write. He moved to the second pin, the third, the fourth recording after each one. Why do you keep checking those? Her voice was not the voice of a child filling silence. It was the voice of someone who had been watching long enough to earn the question. Cobb finished his entry on the fourth pin before answering. Because they need to stay where they are. Marlowe thought about this. What happens if they move? He looked at her across the mowed strip. Someone might think the land moved with them. She was quiet for a moment, then she reached into the front pocket of her jacket and produced a small yellow notebook, the drugstore kind 3 for $1. She opened it and wrote something. Cobb watched without speaking. He recognized the motion with the recognition of a man seeing something he has done himself for 8 years, the reach for a notebook to fix a thing before it becomes only a memory. He did not ask what she had written. He loaded the mower into the truck and they drove home in the kind of quiet that belongs to people who are still thinking about what was just said. Vera had supper on when they came in. She looked at Marlowe. She looked at the yellow notebook visible in the jacket pocket. She looked at Cobb. She set the food on the table and said nothing about it, which was the right response, and she knew it. In the summer of 1986, the second approach came not as a knock at the door, but as a phone call on a Thursday evening from a man who identified himself as an economic development representative for Harlan County. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone working from a prepared text, the kind of flatness that sounds professional until you notice it does not vary and register, regardless of what it is saying. He told Cobb the county had received inquiries about development potential in the northern corridor. There was interest in acquiring right-of-way access for infrastructure purposes. The county was in a position to offer $47,000 for a willing seller. He said, willing seller 3 times in 4 minutes. Cobb told him he would think on it and hung up. Then he called Beverly Oates, a county title researcher who had done work for him before and who had the particular skill of finding things in county records that other people had given up looking for. He asked her to pull every permit application variance request, zoning change petition, and infrastructure filing submitted for parcels in the northern end of Harlan County in the preceding 24 months. Beverly called back 4 days later with 11 items. 8 were filed under different LLC names: Four Corners Development Partners, Ridgeline Holdings, Northern Harlan Land Trust, Crestview Commercial Properties. Each name was distinct, each filing appeared unrelated to the others. Each described a different component of what assembled into a project far beyond agricultural investment: a wellness resort, a golf course, a boutique hotel, retail space, conference facilities. The kind of development that required not a graded farm track, but a proper commercial road paved, engineered for delivery vehicles and emergency access in the daily traffic of several hundred guests. Beverly noted without being asked that all 8 LLCs shared a single registered agent at an office building on Church Street in Nashville, listed under the name Meridian Administrative Services. Cobb put Beverly's report in a manila folder and added it to the desk drawer on top of the stack that had been building since 1975. The drawer now required a deliberate lift on the handle to close against the weight of everything inside. He did not call the findings surprising. He had stood at the eastern end of the corridor in 1975 and looked south for a long time, and what he had understood then had only grown more specific as the years produced their evidence. The ridge was too steep. The creek permits were a 2-year process with poor odds. The fairgrounds were not for sale. These were not facts that changed with time. What changed was the scale of the ambition on the other side of those constraints, which meant the value of the only available solution grew in proportion to the size of what it was being asked to serve. He mowed the corridor that October, checked the 4 pins wrote in the notebook, paid the tax bill the following April, and the years continued, in the way years continue on working land. In the summer of 1994, a man named Prescott Aldrin drove up from Nashville in a rental car and knocked on the front door on a Tuesday afternoon in July. Cobb was 55. Aldrin was somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had been managing difficult conversations long enough that the management no longer showed his effort. He introduced himself as senior counsel for Meridian Agricultural Holdings and said he was hoping to have a frank discussion about the corridor strip. Cobb gestured at the kitchen table. Vera poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and moved to the living room, not because she was excluded, but because the living room connected to the kitchen by an open doorway, and she had learned over years that this position allowed her to hear clearly while leaving the conversation its required shape. Aldrin set his briefcase on the chair beside him rather than on the table, which was a small calculation that Cobb noticed. Aldrin laid out $310,000. He described it as extraordinary twice and as final once. He outlined the development timeline and the county jobs the resort would create. He mentioned in a voice carefully calibrated to neutral that as construction scaled up across the surrounding 7,500 acres, there might be some logistical challenges around accessing a small holding like the Greer property. He used the word logistical. He did not use the word threat because he was too experienced for that and because he did not need to. It was not a threat. It was engineered to feel like one. Cobb picked up his coffee cup and held it for a moment. "I've accessed this property fine for 30 years. He set the cup down. "I expect I'll manage for 30 more. Aldrin's jaw moved slightly, the micro-adjustment of a man recalibrating. He tried a softer version of the same argument framed around the practical difficulties of maintaining an active agricultural operation within the footprint of a major commercial development. Cobb looked at him without shifting. Aldrin packed his briefcase, shook Cobb's hand, said he hoped the offer would receive serious consideration, and walked to his car. Cobb stood on the porch until the car reached the road, then went inside. That evening, Vera sat across from him at the kitchen table. The notebook was open in front of him, but the page was blank. She had heard everything from the living room. She looked at him in the way she sometimes looked at him when she was not asking a question, but wanted him to know she was present for whatever he needed to work towards saying. "How much longer?" Her voice was not impatience. It was the voice of a woman who had been holding something level for a long time and was checking not whether to keep holding it, but whether her husband still knew what they were holding it for. He looked up. "They're about to announce something big." He turned a page in the notebook without writing on it. "When they do, Aldrin won't be the one who comes back." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and went to the kitchen. The sound of water running a dish on the rack, the ordinary sounds of an evening that had been interrupted and was resuming. He understood what the question had been. He understood what his answer had said. He understood why she had accepted it. That was the accumulated weight of 30 years between two people, not the accumulation of certainties, but of the moments when one of them had chosen to trust the other's certainty, and the long record that made that choice feel less like faith and more like evidence. He wrote the date in the notebook. He wrote Aldrin's offer, the amount, and one phrase he underlined once: "Not a threat, engineered to feel like one." He closed the notebook. In September of 1998, Meridian's legal team filed a procedural challenge at the Harlan County Land Court. A dormant easement claim, 53 pages, arguing that because the quarter strip had not functioned as an active road since the state project cancellation in 1956, it had been effectively abandoned under Tennessee property law and should revert to the adjacent landowner, which was now Meridian. The filing cited 4 cases from other Tennessee counties where similar arguments had succeeded. It included an engineering report confirming the strip had never been improved, surfaced, or used for vehicular access. The argument was not frivolous. In other counties for other parcels, it had worked. Cobb read the filing at the kitchen table on a Monday evening. Vera stood behind his left shoulder, reading over him. The clock above the stove measured the quiet. "Is it bad?" Her hand rested on the back of his chair. He read the section on dormant easement doctrine. He read the 4 cited precedents. He read the proposed remedy section. Then he set the filing flat on the table. "It would be," he said, and left one beat of silence before finishing the sentence, "if I hadn't paid taxes on it every year since 1975. He watched her face. She understood before the explanation. 23 years of April payments. 23 years of the county of Harlan sending a bill for that 12-foot strip and receiving a check in return, which meant 23 years of the county itself treating the corridor as an active taxable parcel under continuous private ownership. The dormant easement doctrine required abandonment. Abandonment required that a parcel be unclaimed, unmanaged, unremarked upon by the machinery of county government. But Harlan County had been remarking upon the corridor every April for over 2 decades, not with ceremony or awareness of what it was confirming just with a standard property tax bill sent to Cobb Greer and paid promptly and receipted and filed. The county had been building his defense 1 year at a time without knowing it. He found the abandonment filing in the county index in the spring of 1999, 6 months after Meridian had submitted it. It had been listed under a procedural category that most people did not check, which was almost certainly deliberate. He wrote the filing date, the case number, the attorney of record, and the 4 precedents in the notebook. Then he wrote one additional line: they argued abandonment while the county kept sending the bill. He called Beverly Oates and asked her to pull the complete tax record for the corridor parcel going back to 1940, as far back as the digitized index extended. Beverly called back the following Thursday. 63 consecutive years of tax bills. Everyone paid. Everyone in a Greer name. Harlan had been paying since 1940, 12 years before the state proposed spur, 14B, 16 years before the project was canceled, 21 years before Donahue Voss stood at the front of the fairgrounds and filled the room with his certainty. He had been paying taxes on a strip of land that did not yet have the legal significance that would eventually make it matter paying, because adjacent land was taxed and you paid what you owed, and in doing so had built accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally, a 63-year paper record that would one day walk into a county hearing room and make a 53-page legal filing look like a fundamental misreading of the situation. Cobb put Beverly's report in the drawer with everything else. He mowed the corridor in October of 1999. In April of 2000, checked the pins, wrote in the notebook, paid the tax bill. He ran the orchard. He watched the survey crews on Meridian's land become more frequent, more purposeful, using equipment suited to final preparation rather than assessment. In the spring of 2001, a Chattanooga construction company filed for grading permits on the northern 700 acres of Meridian's land. The project description used the phrase resort and commercial campus for the first time in a public document. The investment figure was $340 million. Cobb read the permit filing in the County Gazette on a Thursday morning. He set the paper down and looked out the kitchen window at the 47 trees in their spring bloom, white and pale pink against the gray-green of the Tennessee hills behind them. He thought about the ridge. He thought about the creek. He thought about the fairgrounds. He thought about the 4 iron pins in their unchanged positions. He thought about Harlan's finger on the paper at the kitchen table in 1961, the single contained gesture that had said everything. He picked up the phone and called Marlo. She was 30 years old, living in Knoxville, 4 years into a property rights practice she had built on the quality of her preparation rather than on any talent for the theatrical. Her colleagues said she had a gift for thoroughness. Cobb knew the gift had been acquired on an October afternoon in 1983 in a truck cab on the way back from a mowed corridor strip from a man who had told her that things needed to stay where they were. He gave her the Chattanooga filing number and the investment figure. He did it in 3 sentences. She was quiet on the other end for a moment. "I'm coming Saturday," Marlo said. "Good." He looked at the trees. "Bring your coat." The phone rang again at 7:18 on a Tuesday morning in October of 2002. Different number, same Nashville area code. Cobb was at the kitchen table. The coffee was cold. The 47 trees were in the window, bare now, their branch structures exposed against the October sky in the way that bare trees show their architecture clearly, each limb visible from root logic to outermost tip. He let it ring twice. The voice on the other end was younger than Aldrin's, and more compressed, the voice of someone who had been given a clear assignment and understood his professional standing, had some relationship to whether he completed it. The offer came in the first 30 seconds. $1.2 million. Clean title transfer. 60-day close. No complications. Cobb looked at the trees. "That's not what I'm selling." His voice was the same voice he used for everything, not weighted, not performed, the ordinary voice of a man stating a fact about his own intentions with no particular need for the other party's agreement. The line went quiet for 1 full second. The pause of someone who had been told this call would be routine and was now understanding that it was not. "Mr. Greer." A careful breath. "What is it you want?" He looked at his cold coffee. He thought about Harlan at 71 with his hands flat on his knees in the second row of folding chairs. He thought about the folded page that had been in the inside pocket of whatever coat he was wearing for 41 years, transferred from one coat to the next, the way you move something you cannot leave behind. He thought about 4 volumes of green notebooks in the desk drawer, every page dated, every pin checked, every April bill paid and receipted. "I'll have someone call you," Cobb said. He hung up. Vera was not yet downstairs, but he could hear her moving above him, the ordinary sounds of a morning beginning in its ordinary way. He sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the cold coffee and the trees in the window. Then he reached for the phone again and dialed Marlowe's number in Knoxville. She answered on the first ring. She always answered when it was him. He told her in 3 sentences. She was quiet on the other end with the silence of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to arrive and is now measuring its actual shape against what she had expected it to look like. "I'm coming Saturday," Marlowe said. "I know," Cobb said. "Bring the box." Marlowe arrived on Saturday morning with a cardboard box on the passenger seat and 4 hours of highway behind her. She had driven before sunrise, which was what she did when something had occupied her thinking through the night, and stillness was no longer useful. She came through the back door without knocking, set the box on the kitchen table, hung her coat on the hook by the door. Vera was at the counter. Cobb was at the table. Marlowe looked at her father for a moment. She did not ask how he was. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, opened the box. She laid the document as out in sequence without being directed. The state notice from March of 1956, its paper the color of old cream, the state seal faded. The quiet title filing from 1975, 2 pages, county stamped sharp in the upper right corner. Beverly Oates' 3-page report paperclipped. The 11 LLC filings with their shared Nashville registered agent. 4 green spiral notebooks rubber-banded in pairs, each cover labeled with a volume number in Cobb's handwriting. At the bottom of the box in its own envelope, the stack of tax receipts secured with a binder clip. 63 years of April payments, the earliest in Harlan's name, the later ones in Cobb's, each date stamped by the Harlan County Tax Office. She read in silence for 20 minutes. Vera set a plate of biscuits on the corner of the table without moving a single sheet. The kitchen held the quiet of people who have learned that certain things require time to read and do not need company while being read. Marlowe turned to the last entry in the 4th notebook. She read it. She set the notebook down flat with both hands, the way you set something down when you want to be sure of its position. "They tried to file an abandonment claim in 1998. Her voice was the voice of an attorney who has confirmed something and is organizing what follows from the confirmation. Cobb looked up. "That's right." "Did you know when they filed it? Found it in the county index in 99. He turned his coffee cup in a slow half circle. "Eunice pulled it for me." Marlowe turned to a fresh page on her legal pad, wrote 2 lines, underlined 1. She was quiet for a moment in the way she had been quiet in the truck in 1983 before she reached for the yellow notebook. The quality of the silence was identical across 19 years. Only the stakes had changed. She looked at her father. "Walk me through what you want." He had thought about this for years, not with obsession, but with the steady preparation of a man who understood that the moment of arrival required knowing exactly what he was asking for, because vague requests produce vague agreements, and vague agreements produce litigation. A permanent access easement across the corridor. Monthly payment of $4,200 beginning the first of the following month. Adjustment for inflation every 3 years, indexed to the Federal Consumer Price Index secured against the Meridian property itself, so that the obligation attached to the land and traveled with it through any future sale or transfer. Transferable to his heirs in perpetuity. Not a sale. The land itself remained in the Greer name and passed to Marlowe and to whoever came after Marlowe for as long as the county kept its records. Marlowe wrote it without asking him to slow down. When he finished, she read it back from her notes item by item, and he confirmed each one. She capped her pen. "They'll push on the inflation clause," she said. "I expect they will. They'll push harder on perpetuity." "I know." She looked at him across the table with the look of an attorney confirming a client's position before walking into a room where that position will be tested. "Neither one is negotiable." It was not a question. He met it with the same steadiness he had brought to every conversation about the corridor for 27 years, the same quality Harlan had brought to a folding chair in the second row of an auction room when a man with a briefcase laughed at a crayon map, and the room laughed with him. "Neither one," he said. Vera came to the table and refilled both cups without being asked. She looked at the documents spread across the surface, at the notebooks, at the stack of receipts under the binder clip. She had read the foundational documents once years ago. She did not need to read them again to understand what they meant arranged together on the kitchen table in October of 2002. She set the kettle back on the stove and returned to the counter, and the kitchen resumed its working quiet. Marlowe called Prescott Aldrin's office at 10:30 that morning from the kitchen phone. She introduced herself as attorney of record for the Greer family land interest, not as Cobb's daughter because the room she was entering was a professional room, and in professional rooms, the relationship that mattered was the one on the letterhead. The tone on the other end adjusted within her first sentence, the subtle recalibration of someone who had been expecting a farmer and received counsel. She told Aldrin's office the family was prepared to appear at the Harlan County hearing on the abandonment claim scheduled for the following Thursday. She listed the 3 documents she would present. She described in plain declarative sentences, without embellishment, the conclusion the hearing officer would reach after reviewing them. Then she asked in the same even voice whether Meridian wished to discuss an alternative arrangement before Thursday morning. Aldrin called back in 40 minutes. The hearing was held on the second floor of the Harlan County Courthouse in a room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat. The hearing officer was a man named Delbert Oakes, who had been adjudicating county land disputes for 16 years, with the temperament of someone who had heard every argument at least twice and was not susceptible to theatrical framing. He sat at the center table with a yellow legal pad and a pen he kept capped until he needed it. Marlowe set 3 documents on the table in front of him. The 1956 state notice with a reversion clause, the 1975 quiet title filing, the stack of tax receipts, 63 years, binder clipped, the earliest ones in Harlan's name, in the tax office's typed font, the later ones in Cobb's handwriting. Meridian's attorney, a man named Whitfield Crane, who had driven up from Nashville the previous evening, presented the dormant easement argument with the efficiency of someone who had deployed it successfully before. He cited the 4 precedents. He submitted the engineering report. He described 46 years of non-use as unambiguous evidence of abandonment under Tennessee law. He was thorough. He was composed. He made the strongest version of the argument the facts available to him could support. Delbert Oakes listened without interrupting. When Crane finished, Oakes lifted the top tax receipt from the stack and looked at it. He lifted the bottom one and looked at it. He looked at the number Beverly Oates had typed at the top of her accompanying summary. He set his pen down on the legal pad and looked at Whitfield Crane. The county taxed this parcel every year since 1940. His voice was the voice of a man clarifying for the record rather than announcing a surprise. That's not abandonment. That's ownership. He ruled for Greer. The proceeding had taken 11 minutes. Crane was on his phone before he cleared the bottom of the courthouse stairs. Aldrin called Marlowe before she reached the parking lot, said Meridian wanted to continue the conversation in a more productive context, and she said that was fine, and she expected to hear from him by end of business Monday. The negotiation ran 3 days. Aldrin opened at $2 million framed as significant acknowledgement of strategic value, a phrase that functioned as its own kind of reveal about how clearly Meridian now understood the position they were in. Marlowe told him the family was not interested in any form of lump sum transfer. She laid out the terms Cobb had given her on Saturday morning, the easement structure, the monthly figure, the inflation index, the security provision, the perpetuity language. Aldrin came back an hour later with a counter. He would accept the easement structure, but proposed a 10-year term with renewal options. Marlowe told him the term was not negotiable. He offered $2.4 million as an alternative framed around family liquidity. Marlowe told him the family had no interest in liquidity on those terms. Wednesday afternoon, Aldrin moved to $2.8 million. His voice had the specific compression of a man managing frustration that has become visible despite management. He called it the final authorized number from the board. He said final the way Cobb had heard final used many times before as a word meant to suggest a door closing, when in fact the door was fixed in exactly the position it had been in since the conversation began. Marlowe said no on behalf of her father. She said it in the same register she had maintained since Tuesday morning without apology, without the verbal softening that functions as uncertainty in formal negotiations. She was not uncertain. Wednesday evening, Cobb sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open to a blank page. Vera was in the living room. The house held the October quiet of a Tennessee evening, a stillness with texture to it The particular quality of a night that has turned cool enough to make the warm inside of a house feel deliberate rather than incidental. He looked at the open notebook. He looked at the window where the orchard was dark beyond the glass, the trees invisible in the way things become invisible at night while remaining exactly where they are. He thought through the offers in sequence. $8,000 in 1979, $47,000 in 1986, $310,000 in 1994, $1.2 million in October, $2 million, $2.4 million, $2.8 million across 3 days of negotiation. He thought about what $2.8 million represented in concrete terms, what it would change, what it would allow, what obligations it would end. He turned these things over without flinching from any of them, the way he examined any situation that required a decision from every angle available without rushing toward a conclusion, because the conclusion had not yet earned its finality. The monthly easement payment, adjusted every 3 years, secured against the land itself, transferable in perpetuity, would continue after him. It would be there for Marlowe. It would be there for whoever came after Marlowe, written into the land's own obligations rather than into any agreement between people who could die or be bought or change their position. $2.8 million would be spent. The easement would be permanent. Harlan had not sold the corridor in 1961 when the price, whatever it might have been, would have solved every short-term problem the family had. Harlan had understood that some inheritances cannot be received in a single transaction. They have to be accumulated, maintained, passed forward whole. What Cobb was building was not wealth. It was tenure, the kind that does not depend on any particular person's goodwill or any company's continued existence, but on a document in a county courthouse that says this obligation belongs to the land. He closed the notebook without writing anything. He got up and went to the living room, sat in the chair across from Vera. She looked up from her book. He did not explain the reasoning. He had spent 30 years not explaining it in real time, letting her watch, instead letting the accumulated weight of the evidence speak where analysis would have been insufficient. She knew what he was thinking. She had known since Saturday morning when she heard him confirm every term on Marlowe's list without softening a single one. "It's going to be the easement," he said. Vera held her place in her book with one finger. "I know," she said, and her voice had the quality of confirmation rather than concession, the tone of someone who is not learning something new, but hearing something said aloud that has been understood for some time. She did not go back to her book. She looked at him across the room for a moment in the lamplight, and he looked back, and between them passed the particular communication of two people who have been doing the same thing together for long enough that words are one of several available channels rather than the only one. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Thursday morning, Aldrin called at 11. His voice had changed in the way voices change when a man has come to the end of the available leverage and is now speaking from a position that is simply what it is, stripped of the calibration he had maintained for 3 days. He accepted the perpetuity language. He accepted the inflation clause indexed to the Federal Consumer Price Index. He accepted the security provision attaching the obligation to the Meridian land. He accepted $4,200 monthly beginning the first of the following month. He did not say final. He said his client was prepared to execute the agreement as described. Marlowe called Cobb at 4:47 in the afternoon. He was in the barn checking irrigation connections before winter, a task that had recently started requiring him to kneel in ways his knees commented on. He heard the phone ring in the house, heard Vera answer, heard her footsteps crossing to the barn door. "It's Marlowe," Vera said. He got up from the ground, brushed the dirt from his jacket, walked to the house. He picked up the receiver. They signed. Marlowe's voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying tension for 3 days and has just set it down, not triumphant, not celebratory. The voice of someone who knows the difference between winning an argument and completing a task. He stood at the kitchen counter. Outside the window, the orchard was in the flat gray light of a late October afternoon. The trees bare their branch structures, making the shapes against the sky that they had made every November of his life. "Okay," he said. He thanked her. He told her to drive carefully on the way back to Knoxville. He hung up. He stood at the counter for a moment, then walked to the living room doorway where Vera was standing, and he told her in 4 words, "Marlowe got it done." Vera looked at him from across the room, not with the expression of someone receiving news, but with the expression of someone who has been present for the entire span of a thing from its beginning through every year of its middle and is now watching it reach the place it was always going. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and the sound of it filled the house the way ordinary sounds fill houses where something important has just finished and everything else is continuing. The signing happened at the Harlan County Clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks later. 3 notarized copies signed by Cobb Greer on one side and Prescott Aldrin on behalf of Meridian Agricultural Holdings on the other. The clerk who processed the paperwork was a woman named Donna Haverstock, 22 years in that office. She stamped the first copy, the second, the third, and then she looked up at Cobb with the recognition of someone pulling a long thread. "Weren't you Harlan Greer's grandson?" she said. Cobb signed the last page of the third copy. "Still am," he said. He shook Aldrin's hand in the parking lot, the grip of a man concluding something he had not chosen to conclude, and was conducting the conclusion with professional correctness. Aldrin got into his car and drove away. Cobb watched him go. He sat in the truck without starting the engine. He opened the fourth notebook, found the next blank line, wrote the date. Then he wrote one sentence. Easement signed. $4,200 due the first of every month. 47 trees still standing. He closed the notebook and set it on the passenger seat. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He had carried the folded page in that pocket for 41 years, transferring it from coat to coat, the way you move something you cannot be without and do not need to look at its presence, a kind of compass that works by weight rather than direction. The paper was the color of old cream, now the same shade as the state notice in the cardboard box. The fold lines had become part of the paper's structure rather than marks on its surface. He unfolded it carefully, one fold at a time. 7 words in the handwriting of a 10-year-old boy writing as fast as he could to get an adult's words exactly right. The land doesn't move, Cobb, only people do. He sat with the words for a while. He thought about Harlan in the second row with his hands flat on his knees, watching Donahue Voss fill a room with the sound of certainty, saying nothing, holding everything. He thought about what it required to sit in that room with that knowledge and let the moment pass without speaking, to walk out to the truck without explanation, to tap one finger on a document at the kitchen table and go to bed and trust that the boy beside him would grow into the man who could understand what the finger meant. Harlan had known in 1961 that the mistake Voss made was not correctable because it was structural. It was built into the transaction at the moment of its completion. It would not become visible for years, perhaps decades, but when it did, it would be absolute because land does not renegotiate and corridors do not move. And 12 feet is 12 feet, regardless of how much money is arranged on the other side of it. Harlan had not been angry at that auction. He had been settled in the way of a man who already understands the outcome and is simply present while the mechanism runs its necessary course. He had passed that understanding to Cobb, the only way it could be passed, not as explanation, but as inheritance tucked into a coat pocket, written by the boy's own hand, carried for 41 years until the morning in a parking lot in Harlan County, when the boy had become an old man and the mechanism had finally run its course. Cobb folded the page back along its original lines. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He started the truck. The agreement ran in the Harlan County Gazette the following Thursday, 3 paragraphs on the local business page with no photograph. The terms were stated plainly. The parties were named. The monthly figure was included. A Gazette reporter had called the Greer property, and Vera had answered and said the family was pleased with the outcome and had nothing further to add, and this appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Donahue Voss was 71 years old that November, living outside Knoxville in a house on 4 landscaped acres his wife had chosen, and he had paid for across 4 decades of commissions from transactions, very much like the one he had completed at the Harlan County Fairgrounds in the spring of 1961. He had his coffee at the kitchen table each morning. He read 2 papers. He read about local business, the way men of his generation and profession read about it looking for movement for what was shifting beneath the surface of publicly stated positions. He came to the Gazette piece on a Thursday morning. He read it once. He set the paper flat on the table with both hands. He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. He thought about the fairgrounds, the folding chairs, the coffee urn by the door, the boy in the second row with the crayon notebook, the red boundary lines, the small green square in the middle of everything. He thought about the sound of his own laugh, how it had moved through the room, how the room had moved with it. He thought about the old man beside the boy with his hands flat on his knees, who had said nothing. He had built his career on reading rooms. He had spent 40 years reading the people inside them, their body language, their hesitation, the degree of tension they carried in their shoulders, and the degree of calculation they tried to keep from their faces. He had read Harlan Greer in the second row of the Harlan County Fairgrounds and had seen stillness and concluded it was resignation. He had seen a 10-year-old with a crayon map and concluded it was evidence that the old man beside him did not understand what was happening. He had been wrong about both. He had not been wrong about any individual observation. He had been wrong about what the stillness meant. He put the paper down. He drank his coffee. The morning was quiet around him in the way of a house where the children have grown and moved away, and the business of things has simplified to its daily essentials. He did not call anyone. He said nothing to his wife who was in the other room. There was nothing the paper had not already said in 3 paragraphs. 3 of the 4 men who had laughed at the crayon map in 1961 were no longer alive. The 4th lived 40 miles away and read the Gazette piece the same morning at his own kitchen table. He read it twice. He set it down and said nothing either. The first check arrived at the Greer property on March 1st in a standard business envelope. Meridian's Nashville address in the upper left corner, the amount correct to the dollar. Cobb set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. He endorsed the back the way he endorsed all financial instruments. Surname first, then given name, then date. He drove to the bank that afternoon and deposited it into the account he had opened for this purpose the week after the signing. He drove home along the county road that ran past the northern edge of the orchard. He slowed at the turnoff without stopping. The 47 trees were in their late winter configuration, their structure fully visible in the bare way of trees, before the leaves return each scaffold branch, tracing its logic from trunk to tip the root line, showing as a slight mounding of the soil at the base of each one. He had learned the responses of each tree individually across 40 years of management, which varieties held fruit longest into October, which ones needed heavier pruning to maintain their center structure, which ones showed stress first in a dry August. He had pruned them the same way every late winter since Harlan had shown him how adjusted over the decades as he learned what each individual tree required beyond what the general principle covered. They were all still there, all 47 of them. He parked in the driveway. He sat in the truck for a moment looking at the house, which was lit from inside the kitchen window, showing the warm, particular light of a place where someone is going about the ordinary business of an evening. He thought about 41 years. He thought about the page in his inside pocket. He thought about what it meant to carry a thing for that long without letting it become something other than what it was, a truth held at the right temperature, neither too urgent to act prematurely, nor too distant to act at all. He went inside, he hung his coat on the hook by the back door. He washed his hands. Vera set 2 plates on the table without looking up. "Check come," she said. "Deposited it," he said. She set the food out. He sat down. She sat across from him. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the 47 trees stood in their rows in the dark, indifferent to Donahue Voss's laugh, to $340 million of stalled construction, to 63 years of April tax bills, to 11 minutes in a county hearing room, to 3 days of negotiation, to the 7 words folded in a coat pocket. They stood the same way they had always stood, which was the way things stand when they have been correctly tended across many years by people who understood that the work was not a means to something else, but was itself the point, the daily and seasonal and annual and generational accumulation of what it means to remain somewhere on purpose. The first of every month, the check would come. The land would not change hands. The trees would continue. The notebook was in the desk drawer with its last line written, waiting for whatever came next to make the next line necessary. That was how the Greer family had always operated, one careful year at a time, each resting on the one before all of it, going back to a box of crayons in a boy's lap. In the second row of a folding chair auction in April of 1961, when a man with a briefcase had laughed and an old man with his hands flat on his knees had led him, and the land had not moved at all.